We have a treat for history readers coming up in this half hour. A local author joins us on the October edition of Oakdale Update. Welcome to Oakdale Update. If you're into history and reading, you'll love this month's guest. Brandt Passick is a local author with a passion for storytelling, and she's written several books, including a novel about a gangster. Betty, welcome to Oakdale Update.
Thank you. It sounds really exciting. Where do I get this book?
Well, I tell you. Okay. Well, I'm glad you're here today. We had a lot of trouble getting put together here, but we finally made it, right?
We did.
Okay. All right, listen, let's start out. Tell me a little bit about yourself, a little history and education, that sort of thing.
I grew up in Fairbank, Iowa, which is the scene for the novels that I've written, although I call them Oxbow in the book, renamed the town. I lived in this small town pretty much all of my life. I moved to the Twin Cities about 30 years ago. I finished my career at 3M and retired about 10 years ago, and during that time I've written 4 books.
Okay. So, what did you do at 3M?
I worked in 3 different divisions, so I moved around, but I did lots of writing for them.
You did? Okay. All right.
So I had my, I knew I could write short pieces. But when it came to retirement, and I always planned to write books in my retirement years, but all of a sudden it dawned on me I really didn't know what I was going to write.
Sure. Okay. So then, okay, well, we'll get into that, but so how did you just feel that you had the writing ability? What way back when, or when you were a kid, or what happened?
Yeah, when I was about 9 years old, I think, is when I started telling people I was going to write books someday. And I don't know where that came from. I had no other authors in my family. My parents, neither one of them went beyond 8th grade in school. So I really didn't have any role models, but I started telling people I was going to write books. Mm-hmm. So,
you know, I think it's in all of us. Sometime we want to write a book. And in my particular business, I don't want to get off the subject, but my particular business, every day is a new adventure. I could write a book about I have so many stories to tell, but I just don't ever get started on it. I had another author on the show too, and she wrote a book about how to write a book. So anyway, all right, anyway, so getting back to you. Okay, let's talk about that first book you wrote. You had published, it's called Gangster in Our Midst.
Well, this is my first novel. I had 2 books before that. And those were memoriams, so I thought when I finished those that I wanted to write a novel to see if I could do that. And so this is the book I wrote, Gangster in Our Midst. The idea came from my early years in this small town. When we moved in the 1950s, the local citizenry told us that there was a gangster in town. And being 9 years old, I had no idea what that meant. So it didn't mean anything to me, but when I was looking for an idea for my first novel, that's where I went to. And I contacted my old school teachers, Sunday school teachers, the town council members from that era, and asked them about this gangster. And that's where I went from there.
So was it real? I mean, I think what I've read on this, you weren't even sure if this really happened, if he really was a gangster. Okay, go ahead. How was it?
So when I asked these people what made them think that this gentleman, this Italian-American man in our town of Swedes and Germans and Irish people, what made them think that he was a gangster, They said it was the way he walked, the way he carried himself, that he didn't dress like the farmers and the townspeople. He always wore a black fedora on the top of his head, smoked a big fat Cuban cigar, and then eventually he started telling people that he did work for Al Capone.
Really?
That he was his bookkeeper. So that's what the town people thought they knew about him.
Okay, his name was LaCava.
Louis LaCava. Is that
Louis
not a
LaCava.
great name?
Honest to God, good Italian.
Yes.
Good Italian boy. So his background. So was he a Chicago gangster or New York, or what was he?
Well, from my research, I think he knew Al Capone from their days as boys in Manhattan.
In Manhattan?
In Manhattan.
Oh, way back then.
Yes. When Al Capone moved to Chicago, I think that's when Louis LaCava followed, because we have police reports of an early arrest about the same time that Al Capone was in Chicago.
Really?
And then eventually Louis LaCava moves back to Manhattan with his wife. And the reason he's in my small town, first of all, is because he's married a local girl in Chicago.
Oh, wow.
And so she brings him home eventually to meet family and friends in this small town.
So at that time he was out of the business with Al, or
No,
what?
I'm sure they were in the business together.
Really?
That's the reason that they were, yes, Al Capone was invited to come to Chicago by a gangster and to take over the business there.
Okay. So now this LaCava, what was his job with Al?
Well, as I said, he was telling the citizenry in Fairbank that he was Al Capone's bookkeeper. So I didn't really, I thought that was going to be really hard to pin down until I looked at the transcript of the trial. The federal government nabbed Louis LaCava, who was in hiding from 2 years because he didn't want to have to testify at Al Capone's trial. But they found him in Ohio and subpoenaed him to testify, and his testimony was about the little ledger they found in one of the Cicero, Illinois police investigations. They found in one of Al Capone's gambling establishments, they found this little ledger that was written in code. It said the ship, this amount of money, and another name of a code word, and this amount of money, and it turned out that those were the receipts for the gambling establishments.
Really?
And Louis LaCava gave testimony about he decoded that book for them and in the testimony.
So he testified against Al.
Yeah.
Okay. Is that why he ended up in your small town then? Was he in hiding? Witness protection, or no?
Well, no. This Al Capone's trial happens in 1931. And I start the story in 1928 in the book. But Louis LaCava was actually in town, had been in town off and on since the early 1920s.
Oh, okay.
So
going home with his wife type thing,
yeah,
huh?
yeah.
Probably.
And they would only, and she had her family living there. So when they came to town from Manhattan or Chicago, wherever they were currently living, they stayed with family members. So it was really a family affair.
He must have been like the fifth wheel on a wagon in your town.
Yeah.
I mean, that's unbelievable. So apparently he wasn't worried about standing out. He wasn't in hiding necessarily, correct?
I think he used the town as a hiding place, yes. But he stood out in the town because he's the only dark-skinned man in the town. So he stood out, and his mannerisms just stood out. Everything about him stood out.
Absolutely.
So he wasn't really very good at hiding in this town.
I'll be darned. So did he go to trial, or did he get exonerated, or what happened to him?
Well, that's the $64 million question, so to speak, is why did Louis LaCava not ever go to prison, or why wasn't he taken out by a mafia member for giving his testimony against Al Capone.
That's shocking. It really is.
That's shocking. But I think in my research that Louis LaCava also tried to stay hidden in Al Capone's organization. And the fact that the feds subpoenaed him to testify had an implication. I mean, what was he going to do? They said, you have to testify, you have to answer these questions or go to jail. I don't think he told them anything that they didn't already know.
Oh.
So perhaps that all played into it. But you're right, most of them ended up at the bottom of the
Of a lake someplace.
Of a lake somewhere.
With cement overshoes.
Yeah,
right?
so to speak. Yep.
That's interesting. But okay, so then did he stay in your town then?
He did. You know, in the 1960s, he actually built a house.
He was still there in the
Yes.
60s.
Yes, and so by then he had a place in Florida where he wintered, and then he would come back in the spring and be there all summer long.
To Iowa,
Yes.
of all places.
Yes, because that's where his wife's family was.
I'll be darned. Did you ever see the movie Goodfellas?
Yes.
Okay, Henry Hill. Now he turned state's evidence on the mafia. He lived a crappy life after that because he missed all the glamour of the gangster life. What about LaCava? Did he miss that? Do you think? I mean,
Well, I interviewed one of the people I interviewed, and I interviewed about a dozen people who were in their 80s, 90s, and 100 who knew Louis LaCava personally. And one of them was Verlie Hahn Trower. And she told me that Louis LaCava built his house just a few blocks north of her house. So frequently when she was out working in the garden, she would see him walk downtown, and she noticed at some point in time that his walk turned from kind of a shuffle to a stride. Like she
Really?
thought you have a bug. She thought that he knew he had gotten by with something.
really?
And he was really proud of that.
I'll be darned.
Yeah.
Ah,
So you should see his house in town. It was built with the construction company in town, double and triple padlocked all the
oh,
windows.
really?
Multiple locks on all the doors. There's an escape route underground under the living room floor.
Oh, my goodness.
And there's some vestiges of his life in Manhattan. He has this beautiful chandelier in the entryway. So it was to show opulence in a small town.
Unbelievable.
And he would invite people in to look at his chandelier. So
Wait, so did he die in your town? I mean, was he?
no, he died in Florida and was brought back and is buried in the Catholic cemetery
No
in town.
way. Oh,
Yeah.
my God.
So he's a Catholic, and he married a Catholic girl. So one of the challenges I had, I'm certain his wife would have insisted that he go to confession. So that was one of the more fun attempts to write a scenario where he would be going to the priest in town.
Honest to God. So how big is that town?
It's about 1,000 people,
Oh,
1,000,
really?
1,200.
Well, he
so
must have stood out like you say, the fifth
he
wheel in a
did,
wagon,
he
huh?
did. And many people, you know, if you live in a community like many of us do these days, where there's gunfire, where there's that presence in your community, you know about it and word spreads.
Sure.
And so that was part of the reputation Louis LaCava got very early on. And so there were people who wouldn't speak with him, wouldn't have anything to do with him if he was at a restaurant in a nearby community. Louis LaCava frequented Owine, where there were about 500 Italians living, and he was frequently could be seen in Owine.
Owine, what is that?
Owine, Iowa. It's a big railroad town that's about 13 miles. I have to get my directions right. East of Fairbank.
Really?
Yeah.
And there was a lot of Italian immigrants in that town?
Yes, and there's a big famous murder that took place there in the early 1900s, and it's definitely a hit job.
No.
Yeah.
We could talk about this book forever.
We could.
But we got other stuff to do. But so he's dead and buried in Eartown.
Yes, he is.
Okay, when you were doing the research on it, did you see a lot of parallels between that and the movie? What I just said?
Godfather.
Godfather. No,
Or the Goodfellas.
Goodfellas.
You know, I would have to think about that movie. I haven't seen it for a while, so I don't know how to comment on that.
Okay. Well, I mean, he just had a lifestyle, and he got into it accidentally, but
Yeah.
terrible. Killer, mean.
Well, I think Louis LaCava started out as a hitman and really didn't have the stomach for it.
Oh.
So I think that at some point, and I write about this in the book, that Al Capone noticed he had a way with numbers.
Oh, okay.
And so, for example, in May of 1925, when the Cicero police invade one of Al Capone's gambling establishments, it's Louis LaCava who makes the phone call to a guy who's living across the street at the Hawthorne Hotel to tell him that the police are there and they're carrying off all of his equipment.
Oh.
And so this man, who it ends up being Al Capone, shows up in bedroom slippers and an overcoat and a trench coat and a hat and over silk pajamas. And the police report said it was Louis LaCava who made that phone call.
Really?
So I knew very early on, you know, one of the hardest parts about the research of this book is actually figuring out who were the people inside Al Capone's outfit where Louis LaCava was part of that. And so those police reports, newspaper reports, tell me those stories of who those people were. So those are the people I narrowed in this book of characters to tell this story.
How long did it take you to put this together?
About a year.
Here it was.
Yeah.
Okay. And did you make a lot of trips back home? Obviously you did.
I did.
And then I understand that you won the Indie Book Award.
I did.
Tell us about that.
Well, you know, it's nice to have your family and friends say, "Oh, I love your book. It's a good book." And that's wonderful. And I sold $5,000 worth of books in the first 12 months,
Really?
which is a milestone for any first-time novelist.
Mm-hmm.
But I did hope at some point in time I would win a book award. The only place I applied for was this Indie Book Award, and I won an award. So, and you know, it's probably the worst thing that can happen to a new novelist is because all of a sudden your ego expands and you start to think, golly, I'm writing something that people like,
Yeah.
you know. So, so that was pretty neat.
So the other thing is too, and I think that, okay, once you publish a book and it does well, now you got to follow up with that. Is that a little hard to do too?
Well, I'm hoping to write an equally good book, if not better, because I've learned a lot from the first book. That's what your first book is. It's a learning experience.
Mm-hmm.
All of my books are self-published. So, so this is a totally different book. It's part of a gangster series. There will be 3 books in this gangster series. But it's a totally standalone book. You don't have to read Gangster in Our Midst first to read this book. And I think it's equally enjoyable.
No, that one's going to be published, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
in
okay.
about 3 weeks the next book will come out.
So what was the most difficult part of doing the research on all this?
Well, as I said, researching these gangsters, because in the 1920s and 30s, every gangster did everything they could to stay below
The radar.
The
yeah.
radar.
Yeah.
Everybody except Al Capone, who seemed to love publicity and
Good.
would have his picture on the front page of every newspaper in the world if he could have made it happen.
Yeah. I'm going to advise you to look back at that Goodfellas, because I mean,
Okay, I
I
will.
see so many parallels
Yeah.
to what's going on here.
Yeah.
That you got to check that one out.
Yeah, it's. I'm sure it's very similar.
I'm sure it
Yeah.
is. Okay, so then now you wrote 2 other books, and let's talk about the first one, We Are 8.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
So it's about the story of. I have 7 siblings, so this was going to, because I didn't really know if I could write a book, I decided to write they say to write your first book should be about what you know. So I thought I would write about us 8 siblings growing up in this small town in Iowa. And I thought initially it would probably be about 100 pages long. My brothers, I have 6 brothers and 1 sister. They love to regale themselves at stories from years ago about who played this trick and who played that trick, and wasn't this relative funny, and you know, all of these funny stories. But when it came time to actually asking them to contribute for this book, they clammed up on me. All of a sudden they weren't sure. They wanted their stories in print. So I quickly decided that I had to, the research and the writing of this book was going to fall upon my shoulders. And it actually took 5 years of research.
Really?
And I found all of my ancestors, my photos, family photos, genealogy, personal histories that they wrote, going back to the 1850s. 4 lineages that all came from Germany and settled, all of them in Bremer County, Iowa, which just blew me away. But they were all German Lutherans, and there was a large German contingency that lived in Bremer County, Iowa. So that made sense all of a sudden, that's why they all ended up there.
They attract each other. They write back home and tell us, you know, hey, it's really great in here, and they're going to come where they feel comfortable, right?
Where they speak the language,
Yep.
where they can help each other get started with their farms, and yes.
So your siblings now, did they come around after you wrote the book, or how?
You know what siblings are. Siblings don't ever say, you did a great job.
Yeah.
They just say, okay, thanks for doing this, and we move on.
So did they look at it as a genealogy book more than, I mean,
You know,
that's what it was. It was a genealogy book, wasn't it, basically?
Well, I think it's much more than that. Genealogy is just a list of names of when they were born and died and married and how many children they had. But this is so much more. That I researched German history in Germany, what that was like, why those Germans left Germany when they did and came to America. I made a case for that, why our relatives ended up here. What a tremendous gamble that was for them, coming to a place that didn't have roads, and you know.
So, but when did they start coming?
1846 was the first one.
Whoa, really?
Yes. Without roads, without bridges.
Oh my goodness,
it was
that's
really
way back.
Yeah.
Oh, because I know my relatives came over in about the 1900s to 105, 1905. So a little, I mean, there was more stuff going on.
And you really have to kind of draw a circle around what your mission statement is for a book, because there are so many rabbit holes you can go down. And like my grandpa Ernst Bartels, I know that he had probably a dozen other siblings. I've not ever researched all those siblings. So I don't know where they ended up or who they really are, but I had to say, this is what I'm going to research and write about in this book. Otherwise, books like that never get completed.
Too many tentacles to get, too much involved, yes.
Yep.
Oh, that's wonderful. I mean, that's so far long ago. I think that's really something.
So I don't think most of my siblings have really read this book, to answer your question, because, but I'm the history lover, and so this was a passion for me.
Okay, so then let's see, what was the biggest find that you found when you were doing that particular book?
You know, to tie this Louis LaCava to Al Capone, I really wanted to find a photo of the two of them together in an old newspaper.
Yeah.
The day I found that
find it.
Berkshire, California newspaper, it was like, wow.
Oh my goodness.
And then the other
So that validated the whole...
That they were part of the inner circle. You know, that was the hardest part, was to find who the real characters were that Louis LaCava and Al Capone were dealing with on a day-to-day basis.
Oh, be darned.
And that solidified it. If he was in a picture alone with Al Capone, he was in his inner circle.
Unbelievable. What a
Yeah.
find. What a find.
Yeah.
Okay, so then another thing you did is did the church history of Arlington, East Arlington Lutheran, I believe it was.
Presbyterian.
Church over on the east side of St. Paul.
Yes.
And you did say that it's still there today. Now, I'm an east side boy, so I remember that church very well.
Do you?
Yes, I do. It was over by Arlington Library, right? The
Yes.
library down the
Yeah.
street.
Yes.
Went there many, many times, yes. So, okay, so you wrote a history of that church.
Yes. So I was in the 4th year of writing We Are 8 when my church decided it was going to close in its 125th year. The membership, the people living around us were Hmong, people who wanted to worship with their own people who spoke their own language, lots of Hispanics in our neighborhood. So the neighborhood had changed, so the church really hadn't grown for many, many years. And so most of the older people were on fixed incomes. We had a large Cameroon community that were newcomers to our church, but they were sending most of their extra funds back to Cameroon to support people there. So there was a small contingent of us in the middle who were keeping this church afloat. And we had done this for 10 years, and we knew that at some point we would have to make a decision about. So because my husband and I were married in this church, I wrote the newsletter for the church, and I decided to take on the project of writing the church's history. It became a 300-page memorial, and it's in the Minnesota Historic Society.
Good for you.
And in Philadelphia in the Presbyterian archives there. And actually I wrote 4 historical pieces to memorialize this church.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
You know, I can relate to that. St. Ambrose over on the east side, same story. Italian community, and everybody started moving away. You know, each generation moved away. I remember talking to the priest, there were 9 baptisms and 50 funerals, so that was the end of that church, so they sold that church too. But I think that was a common thing, don't you think?
Oh, I think that's the reason lots of churches today are closing, is for the same reason. But our church was taken over by a new congregation and then sold to another congregation, so it's still a church.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're running low on time here, so we got to, now you got one more book coming out, The Black Bag of Dr. Wiltse. Wiltse.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that.
And the subtitle is Murder on the Prairie, so it's still part of the gangster series.
Oh, good.
The word gangster was really coined in the 1920s and 30s, but there was still plenty of gangsterism happening before that. So this is a precursor to this book. It begins in the 1850s. Fairbank ultimately gets a hotel in town called Hotel Wiltse. So that's the tie-in to the town again. And I always thought it would be interesting to know what kind of adventures the physician in town and it was a husband and wife, and Dr. Wiltse had his office in this hotel. So I always thought it would be interesting to find out what kind of adventures he had during that era. So that's what this book is about.
What era are you talking about?
Well, this is the precursor. So this book starts in 1928. So I've gone way back to the 1850s when they first came from Canada.
Okay, so this is a fictional book, right? I mean,
it's historical fiction, yes.
Oh, that's great.
I mean, the story it's based on a true story, but and the characters are people who lived during that era. But of course, I've found them in newspapers and history books, and I've used that to tell a fictional story.
We are so out of time, I can't believe it. But it's been absolute pleasure talking to you today.
It's been fun to talk about this.
Oh my God, you did a fine job.
I love this story. It's a fun story.
Well,
it's a fun read.
I'm gonna have to get that one.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Frank.
That's all we have time for on this edition of Oakdale Update. Here are some reminders for residents of Oakdale on our way out. Thank you for watching.